Home stretch with this book, we are almost there. Like, we're rounding third, but aren't quite ready to slide into home just yet. But I'd still say we knocked it out of the park. This terrible, terrible park. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi! Welcome back to this cognitive psychologist's penultimate video on Abigail Shrier's Irreversible Damage. Penultimate because we're going to roll together the book wrap-up along with stories. And these stories are both the ones that Shrier shares in what is the actual last chapter of the book, Where Are They Now, for everybody whose story was shared by their parents, as well as stories submitted to me back in January. Things continue to somehow get worse. The current iteration of worse is the neurologist specialist referral somehow turning into a nephrologist referral. Like kidney doctor, not brain doctor. Maybe they just clicked the wrong box. And pain management, first available is in August, so. Before we get into this last chapter, I'd be curious to know how you all think Shrier is going to wrap up this book. What her final point is going to be from all of this. I think she's going to manage to surprise you. Not in a good way. I don't do this often, but hey, if you've liked these videos, subscribe. It's free. Unless you don't want it to be, in which case check out my Patreon or pick up some epic swag. Do people still say epic or swag? Well, one does at least. Anyways, quick refresher for the visual shorthand to indicate where ideas are coming from in these videos. This means I'm paraphrasing the book. This means I'm sharing my thoughts on the book or responding to Shrier's references. I do drop a little science here and there, but it's going to be in voiceover form, and changing all the camera setups and lights and everything is a process. As for Shrier's references, well, there's 8 of them, and you'll see. Certainly not worth moving the camera and everything. And on that note, let's get started on the way back. The way back apparently starts with none other than Buck Angel. What to say about Mr. Angel for those unfamiliar? I first heard of him in the late 90s, early 2000s, somewhere around there, when he was on HBO's Real Sex, as a porn star who was a trans guy was a huge novelty. Since then, Angel has proven himself to be quite the asset for the gender-critical crowd. He believes, among other things, that trans women shouldn't be allowed into women's spaces, sports, and as Shrier will get to, that these AFAB transgender non-binary youths have been led into falsely believing that they are transgender non-binary. There is a ton more to say here, and lucky me, somebody has. Jesse has a full video going through all of this in much more detail, so link in the description if you want to check that out. Shrier wastes no time in getting to the glowing descriptions and flowery language while describing their visit. The muscles, the clothes, the assigned sex at birth.
I couldn't shake the feeling that despite all appearances, the freckled pate rendered bald by decades on testosterone, in a real sense, I was talking to a woman. Buck wasn't at all offended when I told him this. He readily acknowledges his female biology, which he says is only to his advantage. It helps him relate to the women he woos in a way few men can. He prefers the term transsexual, someone who medically transitioned to transgender. He doesn't pretend he was always really a man.
Yes, dear viewer, Shrier's basically painting Angel with the one of the good ones brush, while also implying that he's different from other trans or non-binary people because he doesn't deny his biology, or do any pretending. Which is of course missing the detail that most, like we're talking almost universal most, trans and or non-binary people are fully aware of their biological situation and past. This information may be a bit obscured if you don't know the person particularly well, or if you're in a public setting where breaking stealth may put them in danger. Or when legislation's being pumped out that's trying to criminalize them or erase them for being trans and or non-binary. The defensive ditches have to be dug a bit further out in that case. The primary question Shrier had for Angel is if he thinks that these AFAB trans and or non-binary youths are receiving good advice, mental health care, and medical care, and he doesn't think they are. And it's because he thinks that social media is like candy to these youths, because it's saying transition will make them feel better about themselves. This is something that seems to be lost on the gender critical crowd. For trans and or non-binary youth who want to transition, yeah, no duh, being able to transition is going to let them feel better about themselves. Being able to be comfortable in their body, live authentically, and be accepted for who they are is going to increase good vibes. This isn't gender rocket science. Rocket gender science. Echoing ideas we've seen many times in this book, Angel tells Shrier that these kids may not be in a good headspace.
So when we see these kids all speaking the same language, all doing the same thing, they want to transition right away. They think it's a fix. That's what they think. They think it's going to fix everything about the way I feel about myself. And that's the dangerous part. It's not going to fix everything until you fix your brain.
As we've covered previously in this series, immediate transition is incredibly rare. The process tends to be much lengthier, especially if you're under 18. Also, it probably can't be said that no one has ever thought that transition would magically fix their life, but it seems that most people have more realistic expectations for what they'll gain from transitioning. And if the stories I've received are any indication, it helps a lot. The first reference of this section is attached to Shrier's description of Angel's medical history. Reference 1 is to the book Unbound, Transgender Men and the Remaking of Identity. This book follows 4 AFAB people around the time they get top surgery at a particular clinic. Note that Shrier is citing one page in particular, the page where Angel's metoidioplasty is discussed. I suppose it would be too much to ask for Shrier to read a book about the experiences of some trans men without the gender-critical baggage. Angel thinks extensive therapy needs to go alongside medical transition to help these youths figure out their gender identity, that they don't have the experience at that age to figure it out on their own. I've got a couple different ways on how best to say this next point. What you're going to see is the quick version. Basically, gender therapy is probably useful for some people, especially if they're kind of on the fence about things or if they don't feel the bodily discomfort as deeply as other people seem to. Talking these things out and bouncing them off another person who specializes in this particularly may help them figure these things out. But for people who are sure about these things, that therapy probably won't be as useful. And insisting that everybody goes through this extensive therapy before being allowed to transition is just loading an unnecessary and unneeded burden on a not insignificant number of people. But of course, there's this idea again, that these youths couldn't possibly have the experience needed to really understand themselves. A psychologist who may or may not be okay with their patient being trans and or non-binary is obviously the one to help them figure this out. Shrier calls Angel heroic. Courageous. Shrier calls Angel courageous for talking about these things. He says that he has to because a sudden epidemic of AFAB transgender non-binary youth must be met with skepticism. Otherwise, these youths will be a decade into their transition and regretting it. Think of the children protecting the kids from themselves version. And if you're wondering, would they say this about gay kids? We're getting there. Angel thinks that these youths are figuring out who they are, and so all actions need to be seen as experimentation by adults, as opposed to sincere feelings.
Many of these AFAB youths, perhaps most of them, are not really meant to be transgender at all. You could totally be gay, and now we're pushing AFAB youth who want to wear boys' clothes into being trans? You can't just say because someone dresses like a boy, you're a boy.
Except we aren't pushing the boys' clothes wearers into the boy gender box. There is a difference that may very well be lost on Shrier between wanting to wear the boys' clothes and wanting to be a boy. The sex and gender curriculum she is so vehemently opposed to explains this to kids, that gender expression and identity, and sex and attraction, aren't intrinsically tied to each other. Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? Gender Edition. Ignoring the trans medical elephant in the room, Shrier talks about Angel feeling like medically transitioning helped save his life. He also feels that all of the medical gatekeeping was a necessary thing to have a secure transition, and that all of it was actually a good thing because it helped prepare him for his life. Cool for him, I guess. But crazy idea, I know. How about we not push that on everybody, especially as it can draw out the start of treatment and prolonged suffering? Shrier is going to now attempt a Peterson pivot. You tell me how successful she is.
I told Buck one of the aspects of the current trans phenomenon that unsettled me the most was its anger, the in-group, out-group hysteria, the insistence on naming and punishing enemies. And another thing bothers me too, the apparent asexuality of the members of this group. Were any of these teenagers interested in having sex one day? In so many instances, the more dramatically these trans-identified teens transfigured their bodies, the more their dysphoria spiked, the harder they pushed away even the possibility of sexual intimacy.
In a previous video, we talked about the social mobbing that can happen in these spaces, and it does happen. But there's a couple things to not forget here. First, this isn't something that happens exclusively in online trans spaces. It's part of the social media environment at this point. Second, Shrier's talking about a group whose rights are currently being chipped away at, who've had to deal with hostile infiltrators and flighty allies. Trying to carve out a safe space to occupy may feel like something that has to be ferociously defended. But yes, Shrier is talking about how these teens really just need a good dicking or pussing or something. How transitioning is going to rob them of their ability to sex. We know who she's been talking to, but from what I've heard, transition generally helps people be more comfortable in their body, which then boosts their sex life. Assuming they want to have one at all. Shrier erasing asexual and or aromantic people? Who could have seen this coming? Shrier spends a couple paragraphs bemoaning the lack of teen sex. How sad to be more interested in transitioning than sexual fantasies. The, quote, sad cult of asexuality, end quote, possibly born out of porn and beauty standards. She says that AFAB people who bind or have top surgery are essentially giving themselves a chastity belt, because if you're that uncomfortable with yourself, how could you possibly have sex? Buck agrees with all of this. She is so fixated by this, even though her own reference for this from earlier in the book talked about the boinking rates being down for all age groups. It's not just the youths having less sex, it's everyone. Taking a step back for a moment, it's almost impressive how she strung together so many originally nuanced tidbits into this larger argument that these AFAB trans and or non-binary youths are actually negatively impacted by transitioning. You may think you know where the section's going based on the title, and you'd be correct. Mostly. This section begins with Shrier painting the AFAB puberty picture as akin to a tornado, violent and without warning. Specifically, the cramps or menstrual blood leakage in class. She says, the path to womanhood is neither easy nor elegant, and that the thought has occurred to young women that it's easier to be a boy. And her support for this is coming from Viola from Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, Beyoncé's If I Were a Boy, as well as the biblical Eve. There's missing the point, and there's missing the point. Superficially, I suppose you could call Viola shifting to living as a man about ease, if you define easier as finding yourself shipwrecked in a new country, your brother possibly dead, and having concerns about your safety as an unaccompanied woman in Shakespearean times. The song is more about how the singer would be a better partner than their ex if put in the man's seat, and while it and the video do touch on what's considered normal-ish behavior in straight relationships, it isn't about boys or men having it easier. Finally, Eve. Shrier says Eve was, quote, punished with labor pains and a domineering husband, end quote, but Adam got off easy with, quote, the burden of having to work for a living. Big deal. It's a wonder this wasn't a point of contention when she was on Peterson's podcast. Maybe they had bigger fish to fry. Or maybe I'm the only person who doesn't just fucking skim things these days. Any event, these were interesting choices to go with. The next part seems terribly disconnected from the idea that men have it easier. She continues like it's the same thought, but it's not.
Far from remaining an ephemeral notion or source of humor for women, this thought has ossified into a worldview. It lurks within the scolding that women who take time off for their families have failed to lean in. And within the tiresome insistence that jobs women disproportionately occupy, teachers, literature professors, psychologists, gynecologists, are somehow less worthy than those men tend to dominate. CEOs, software engineers, math professors, psychiatrists, orthopedic surgeons. That men also overwhelmingly occupy many lower status and dangerous jobs, construction laborer, logger, groundskeeper, roofer, cabbie, janitor, doesn't get mentioned much.
Shrier boils this down into people jobs versus thing jobs with a reference, But to make this easier for editing me, it's to a comment that this explanation came from the founder of Fourth Wave Now. Why go through the labor-intensive step on finding research on something when you can just phone a friend? Yes, there are currently overall differences in who generally does what, but we can't tease out the impact of living in a patriarchal society that has only really tried addressing these differences a little bit outside of my lifetime. And even then, a lot of effort is focused at an individual level as opposed to working to change the global problems, like early educational things to get girls more interested into things like coding, but not addressing the old bros club of potential employers. I'm not sure how women thinking men have it easier would lead to the worldview that women are in less worthy jobs than men, or that they shouldn't try to maintain a work-life balance. If anything, that worldview seems contradictory to the premise. I know I'm just one needle in a huge haystack, but I do try to incorporate labor disparity discussions when it comes up. There is a whole host of reasons why men are disproportionately represented in some of these fields, and check out that video for more thorough discussion of that. Shrier continues that this has been a tricky point for feminists who, according to Shrier, have been trying to get people to go against nature and force society to make women shift their preferences. But this implies that the innate preferences are inferior, which leads to AFAB youth trying to be more masculine. Quote, AFAB youth are left to conclude that they must strive to be more like men. They must want things men want because men want them. Well, I do agree that there is some shitty valuing of certain topics or fields as a result of the patriarchy. This isn't transing the youths. Kitty. Easy, kitty. Oh no. Oh no. Interrupting my thought. There certainly was some misguided let's get girls into STEM stuff when I was growing up, but it's shifted since then. The emphasis used to be on trying to get people to mold themselves into the box appropriate to the field they wanted to go into, but now it's more about making the field itself more accommodating for people. This is a good thing. Then there's a bit about the gender gap in CEOs, saying that really, the men in these positions are the ones to be pitied because of the associated life costs. On the back of that, she says that the case could just as easily be made that women are the wiser sex for valuing relationships over money. She notes a contradiction. On the one hand, saying that women are being unfairly excluded by men and should be CEOs, but also that CEOs have terrible personal lives. Here's a radical idea. It's possible for both of these things to be true. There's a not great human labor situation where the arms race for getting promotions involves sacrificing the work-life balance. There is also the gender gap in CEOs, which may be indicative of the old boys club and exclusive environments that can permeate these spaces. We're getting away from where Shrier is going with this, but there is a potential solution for these two problems. Stop rewarding people for being married to their jobs, which then could help open things up for women who tend to get saddled with the unpaid household labor.
Nothing I have written here should be taken to discourage AFAB youth from wanting to become CEOs or math professors. The point is only that women need to own up to a hard truth. We assume, so often, so immediately, that the guys have it better, that whatever men want must be better too.
Shrier? That's the patriarchy talking. Valuing men's stuff because men? This doesn't mean that the AFAB youth who are trans and or non-binary are doing that to hack the hierarchy. She says we denigrate motherhood and treat stay-at-home moms, not dads apparently, as losers, and she has personal experience with this.
We must stop. It's a dumb habit, thoughtless and base. It reflects an unflattering insecurity we shouldn't indulge. The jealousy at its heart suggests that either we believe women aren't truly capable, or they have somehow been duped, made victims by a system that, generation after generation, locks us out and shuts us in with so many glass ceilings and walls. It's an exhausting set of untruths. Worst of all, AFAB youth are listening. They don't know it's all tongue-in-cheek. They don't realize we're merely garnering support for women's causes, bargaining with the culture for better jobs and greater pay. They don't know we're merely whipping the polls. They actually believe us.
I do agree that there is some toxic femininity at play with the types of judgment moms can get. I had to work through that myself. But the rest of this? Strongly disagree. I don't understand where jealousy would be coming into play here. I get that she's saying it's the core of the insecurity, but Insecure about what, exactly? The ability to work on par with men. The value of what a person is doing? The middle part of this quote, though? Shit. What is her alternative to these untruths? That women are going their own way when it comes to specializations and job choices? That the women who have hit the glass ceilings were doing it to themselves? Be fucking precise in your speech, Shrier. And while I'm cursing, what the fuck is this? What about fighting for inclusivity and equality hasn't been sincere? Merely garnering support for women's causes? What the fuck does she think feminism is? Some parents have reached out to Shrier to share their stories, some looking for advice. And almost everything that follows from this point is advice for the parents, not the youths. Quick formatting note before we get into the advice. She starts the numbered list later, but we're going to throw all of the advice into the same list. But hey, she's committing to the list beyond the first item, so in that regard, she's a better writer than Peterson. First, get into a support group. Quote, "The good ones will help you navigate staying connected with your child without participating in their indoctrination." It's a wonder she didn't drop a reference to Fourth Wave Now or the other websites Littman likes to sample from. And then you realize that you're suggesting how to better direct parents to the gender-critical websites. Also, as pointed out to me by Dr. Mr. the Script Reviewer, supportive online spaces is the exact thing Shrier's been telling these parents is transing their kids. Hypocrisy? I don't know how she could possibly afford it in this economy. Second, remember that this isn't really about your child's gender, so you shouldn't be affirming in your treatment of them. But this is really in the child's best interests because the parent should be the reality check. Right. Yeah. A youth identifying as transgender or non-binary isn't actually about their gender identity at all. It's about unattached anxiety, or wanting to look heroin chic, or beating the patriarchy. This Jungian therapist says so, so it's gotta be true. Third, you have facts and logic on your side against the gender confusion being sown in schools. I don't know if we ever got a solid why for this alleged idea farming. In the schools chapter, there was some stuff about the schools needing to provide info about gender and orientation to students because what they're getting at home is inaccurate. Where's the lie, though? Shrier also seemingly willfully missed the point on potential elementary curriculum. This is despite the person she spoke to, who is the Human Relations, Diversity, and Equity Programs Coordinator for the LA School District, saying part of this is to help normalize LGBTQ people. Shrier said it was strongly encouraging kids to pick an identity to get specialness points. Shrier put forward the surface-level justification in this as boiling down to anti-bullying measures, but really it's to indoctrinate kids with gender ideology. The closest she came to a why here was that the actual bullies these schools are trying to protect kids from is their own parents. Again, the core idea here isn't necessarily wrong, just the framing and the valence and the context of it is. Like, some kids legitimately need to be protected from their parents. Yeah, some school districts are doing what they can for their LGBTQ students because not everybody has a home situation where they won't suffer consequences for not being cis or straight. Because of that, these schools cannot inform these parents without potentially putting those students in danger. The thing that is missing here on Shrier's end is the why behind it all. Why would school districts want to brainwash the youths into accepting gender ideology? What would be the end goal there? Given all of the bullshit that has developed since this book was published, we can hazard some guesses for who the big baddies of this book would be if she were forced to spell it out. Fourth, and the first of her numbered list, is to not get your kid a smartphone. She says that this is pretty obvious and easy, and that the modern woes can be laid at technology's feet. She did provide some support for the risks and costs associated with cell phone use way back in the first chapter, and we only learn more and more about the shady shit Meta has done and the negative impact it's had on youths. Part of the issue here is lumping in a trans and or non-binary gender identity with things like eating disorders or self-harm, instead of things like sexual orientation and attraction. The other issue part is who this advice is going to potentially impact. An AFAB youth with at least one parent diving into gender-critical beliefs. Shrier may see this advice as saving these youths from themselves, but realistically, it'll be cutting off a lifeline to the outside world. These parents always seem so shocked when all of a sudden their child gets so secretive or cuts them out of their life entirely when they get a chance. Like, honey, of course they went behind your back. You're toxic as fuck. They had to get their compassion from somewhere. Next piece of advice is to not relinquish your authority as a parent. Almost type that out as control. Fits better. Before getting to the gist here, I want to draw your attention to something. That the parent doesn't have to go along with their child's claims about their sexuality or identity. The child's sexuality is apparently on the parental veto desk now too. The gist here is that someone can't know their orientation or identity without real-world experience. While some people have talked about empirically testing their orientation, that generally seems to be more about figuring out where the boundary actually is. Like being attracted to somebody and interested in doing things sexually, and then finding out if that's actually something you enjoy. But so many more people have the experience of, for example, just knowing that they're gay. Maybe if we lived in a less heteronormative society, the straights would be able to reflect on this experience for themselves. But for gender identity, how does one go out and do a gender? The obvious answer is to play around with different identities and expressions and see what feels best for you, but we know how Shrier feels about that. Her advice is consistently centered on having the sexual intercourse assigned at birth. That advice to parents is in no way super disturbing and couldn't possibly lead to horrific situations. Your child getting mad at you in these situations is a good thing. They're supposed to get angry and emotional sometimes. That means you're doing your parental job right. These kids need to feel pushback while rebelling. If you don't provide that, things will only escalate. I hate all of this so much. There is a huge difference between being mad at your parents for a curfew and being mad at them for invalidating your very identity. That Shrier sees these as equivalent is telling. 6. Don't support gender ideology in your child's education. Her explanation here again puts gender identity in with psychological disorders. For the billionth time, the consensus is that gender identity is not a psychological disorder and should not be treated as such. I'm annoyed enough about this, we're just going to mention the references here. 2 are to the book Strange Contagion, Inside the Surprising Science of Infectious Behaviors and Viral Emotions and What They Tell Us About Ourselves, which seems to somewhat drop the ball as a useful pop-sci book, and a paper about the social contagiousness of self-harm, except the abstract disagrees with Shrier here, in that the primary prevention programs don't seem to increase the behavior happening. GG. With regard to the idea that students will catch a transgender non-binary identity from a school assembly, if these things worked that way, either most everybody would just be cis because of the society we live in, or there would be more growth in the number of transgender non-binary youth. Neither of these things is happening. I will give Shrier one small, microscopic concession here, though. The number of people identifying as non-binary may be growing as a consequence of awareness, but it's not because people are just being NB'd by finding out about it. It's that people are finding out there's a space to not have to fit the gender binary, and it resonates with them. 7. Reintroduce privacy into the home. Basically, don't broadcast all aspects of your life online. I can agree with the gist here. It's useful to keep in mind that anything and everything you put online could be there forever and is potentially accessible to anyone with an internet-capable device. But we're at the Peterson problem here. The gist is fine, the specifics less so. A child's deets shouldn't be blasted online because, according to Shrier, that will make it harder for them to change later on. It will also be a beacon for groomers. We didn't have that terminology mapping when this book was published, but that's basically what she's talking about here. The idiotic idea that youths are being enticed into feeling or believing things by LGBTQ adults who are trying to shape them for their own twisted ends. I am so glad we are almost done with this book. Next point. Consider big steps to separate your child from harm. One of the steps in a lot of abusers' handbooks is to isolate their target from outside support. That's basically what Shrier is telling parents to do here. Pull your kid out of the social environment they're in, cut them off from friends and family online, and physically move them somewhere else, somewhere you can control them better. 9. Stop pathologizing girlhood. Shrier adores her daughter and argues that girls are built different than boys. Let them be girls. But boys can also have all these qualities Shrier described. Depending on their parents, this can be cultivated or it can be crushed. But we aren't focusing on boys right now. We're talking gender differences again, and the thing to always keep in mind when we're talking about these differences when they're found empirically is we're talking on average. Some girls may be super cuddly and empathetic, some won't be, and some will go beyond the boys' average on these traits. Potential gist for this next part. Teenagers need space to be in their feelings and figure things out, but it's still good to have boundaries for them. But that's glossing over adolescence being difficult for everyone, not just AFAB youth. I'm a bit horrified by her reading of Sleeping Beauty and other fairy tales. And again, being trans and or non-binary isn't a mental health problem. Gender dysphoria? Sure, get help for that. But the identity itself is not something that needs to be fixed. There's a throwaway line about women identifying other women as their best friends, as opposed to men saying their wife is their bestie. There is a huge problem with Shrier's citation. What she has referenced doesn't exist. There is a book called Interpersonal Communication, Putting Theory into Practice, but it wasn't published in 2012, and it's not by any of these people. What Shrier seems to be referencing is actually in the book A Cultural Approach to Interpersonal Communication, Essential Readings, but Tannen's paper is outside the free preview, and this is a pretty minor point. Maybe it was reported in whatever sample that most men said their spouse was their BF while women said it was another woman. It would be interesting to know the demographics for the sample, because maybe there's something like a generational difference going on there. Shrier's claim is not representing my truth, at least. I would say my husband is my number one best friend. Moving on. There's more women are the emotional pillar stuff, and some stuff that seems to imply these AFAB trans and or non-binary youth are letting their emotional lives overwhelm them and to stop trying to put themselves in men units. Are the cis straights okay? Published book edition. Shrier seems to have a really skewed view of what feminism's pushing for, and of what trans men and or non-binary people want, and of men in general. 10. Don't be afraid to admit, it's wonderful to be a girl. If you're a girl, sure. If you're not, it isn't. Shrier High School soccer story that we're skipping. She says everyone transitions on some level, and it's a process that involves a sense of loss. Going from child to adult woman means growing into a body that is, quote, softer, more sexually inviting, but more vulnerable too. Not being able to physically match men, women have to, quote, rely on subtler talents.
But for Pete's sake, whatever type of women AFAB youth become, they should all listen to feminists of a prior era and stop taking sex stereotypes so seriously. A young woman can be an astronaut or a nurse. A girl can play with trucks or with dolls. And an AFAB person may find themselves attracted to men or to other women. None of that makes them any less of a girl or less suited to womanhood.
Is it really this hard for her to get that transgender non-binary people aren't basing their identity solely on these stereotypes? This isn't about these AFAB youths feeling alienated from girlishness or womanhood based on outdated views of what those represent. Shrier advises the reader to really emphasize to their AFAB offspring that women have it great today. And that, quote, women's most unique capacity, childbirth, is perhaps life's greatest blessing. If you're wanting to be a parent. If you don't want to be a parent, childbirth is a fucking curse. She wants you to tell your AFAB offspring that they are so lucky and special for having been born into the gender they were because, quote, being a woman is a gift. Ah, yes, it truly is a gift to be physically weaker than roughly half of the population, to have your reproductive freedom destroyed by older men, to have often contradictory expectations for who you should be and how you should act. The juxtaposition is almost absurd. Don't let stereotypes tell you what you can and can't do. As long as you conform to the compulsory cishet duty and bless yourself with babies. Always gotta make those babies. Shrier describes the mental toughening she went through in writing this book because of the stories she encountered, including one YouTuber who described regretting their bottom surgery and transitioning. Reference 8 is to a couple YouTube videos by one person. I've got it blurred because the videos are no longer accessible and this name doesn't have a current online footprint, just things that are several years old. Maybe they detransitioned but don't want the attention. Maybe the feelings expressed in these videos were temporary. Either way, this illustrates the danger of using social media as a reference. Things could just get deleted. At some point while she was writing, Shrier had a visit with an old dear friend of hers, who expressed her extreme upset because of Shrier pushing these ideas.
I admire her and love her very much, and the conversation shook me. Because of course I hated the thought that my efforts to investigate a peer contagion sweeping the Western world might harm people. I have nothing but respect for the transgender adults I've interviewed. They were among the most sober, thoughtful, and decent people I had come to know in the course of writing this book.
Of course, the framing for her concern is that this is a legit phenomenon. The only harm would come from her covering it. Not that she's amplifying what amounts to a conspiracy theory we're seeing escalate in real time. Hey Shrier, I ain't your friend, but just reiterate what she said to you. Your book is doing harm. It's resulting in real-world harm. You have blood on your hands. Respect is apparently point-blank telling a trans man they're feminine to their face, or scrutinizing strangers' social media accounts and telling your readership how horrible or unconvincing they look post-transition. Despite what her friend said, Shrier pushed forward with this book because of the AFAB youths who are tearing themselves apart as a consequence of our pursuit of identity politics and progressive bona fides. And she says that any sort of concern or criticism for these youths is met with negativity, and then basically argues that these youths aren't really trans. Well, I mean, we knew this, but she's restating it. For a person to actually be trans, in her opinion, they have to have been experiencing gender dysphoria since they were a kid. First, the only place where duration of gender dysphoria is relevant is when we're talking about someone's gender dysphoria. It isn't a requirement for a trans and or non-binary identity. Second, that a lot of the parental stories she's shared illustrate some outward displays of dysphoria in the kids continues to be lost on her. Finally, there is a difference between a reasonable amount of concern for youths undergoing social transition or medical treatments and procedures, and there's transphobic fear-mongering. Speaking of,
all the institutions we've built to keep young people from making irreparable mistakes have failed them. The universities, the schools, the doctors, the therapists, and even the churches have been won over by a dogged ideology that claims to speak for a more important class of victim.
That damn dogged ideology of respecting people's identities and expressions. Truly, we are seeing the end of Western civilization as a consequence. And then there's that victim hierarchy again. Never mind the intersectionality of harm that seems to be coming full force for trans and or non-binary people of color. But won't somebody think of the real victims here? The parents.
People who've been sold the promise of metamorphosis hold in their hands a bill of goods. But they retain one last redeemable asset. The parent who have never stopped worrying and still hope for a call. As far as I can tell, this card never expires.
The card may not expire, at least for the parents who haven't outright disowned their kids, but holy shit does it come with some fine print. It seems that for so many of these parents, love and acceptance is conditional. You'll only be greeted with open arms if you go back to being their cisgender baby girl. Anything less than that, and they have reservations. The rest of this chapter is aimed directly at AFAB trans and or non-binary youths or young adults who have severed their ties with their family, and it seems incredibly mean-spirited.
I know your parents aren't the glitter family you might have wanted. They can't seem to quit that birth name they dumbly believe they have the right to give you just because every parent since the beginning of time has assumed the same. They don't know the difference between genderqueer and transgender, no matter how many times you explain it. Worst of all, they may never see you as the sex you wish to be.
We're going to go through this point by point because I'm mad. Never ascribe to malice that which can be adequately explained by stupidity, but I can't believe she's this fucking dumb. I imagine for most people who've had to cut out their family, it wasn't that they wanted a glitter family. If their own folks could have been supportive non-assholes, finding a friend family wouldn't have been needed. Shrier missing the point, yet again. The issue with parents persisting in using someone's birth name after they've requested them not to is the utter lack of respect it demonstrates. The problem isn't having been named, it's that name not fitting the person anymore, and the parent's refusal to see that. A parent doesn't have to understand all the lingo in the gender space. They just have to understand that it matters to their kid and what they can do to respect and help them. Ignorance is no excuse when someone has told you and corrected you about their name and pronouns. The difference between someone fighting ingrained habits but trying and someone needling with a dead name is pretty apparent. Acting coy only makes it worse. Along those lines, how a parent perceives a kid should only matter to the parent. If they can't ever see their trans and or non-binary kid as such, but they love and respect them, that parent will keep that shit to themselves. Not everything needs to be shared. That this is Shrier's worst case scenario gives us some indication that all the danger statistics have not been absorbed.
So maybe your friends and therapists are right. Your parents have become toxic, not worth the trouble they cause. They're just the losers who crawled into your cramped bed at every nightmare, wordlessly forfeiting another night's sleep, then leapt awake the next night to do it again. They held your wriggling form through every shot and stitch, and spent more nights than anyone can remember listening to the uneven flow of your breath.
This seems incredibly passive-aggressive. Like, how dare you be true to your gender identity and expression? Think of your parents. Think of everything they went through.
They fumbled plenty, far too excited for your 6th grade play, oblivious to your broken heart. And now that your need for them is over, helpless and lame, they can't seem to stop. They should see you as the adult you've become. Instead, they look at you and see their whole world.
This is some entitled, manipulative shit going on here. We're just so helpless and lame. I can't respect you as an adult because you're my whole world, and I just can't seem to quit you. Woo-hoo. These parents not being able to let go of the image they have of their offspring as a child, that's a them problem, not their kid's problem. Last paragraph. You ready?
Maybe they'll never understand you. Maybe you know the life you want, and maybe you're already leading it. Then you have nothing to lose. How about giving them a call?
Shrier has clearly never dealt with an abusive person in her life. Or, perhaps worse, she has, but can't see how these parents who've been cut off were actively harming their kids. Cutting a person out of your life is not something people do on a whim. It is hard. Especially because of people like Shrier coming in with like,
oh, they're your parents. It can't be that bad. You can't cut them out of your life. They're your parents, you monster.
Again, it's hard to know here how much is willful ignorance or aggressive indifference, but there is something to lose in contacting someone who has driven loved ones away. Assuming the parents continue to deny their child's identity, there's a mental health hit from having to engage with the transphobic noise from them, or walking on eggshells to avoid any topics that could potentially launch into that. That's tiring. There's a potential risk by opening up communications with that parent who was previously excluded. The parent will take that as an invitation that they really should try to do everything in their power to get their child to desist. And if contact was broken because of threats of violence, don't call that parent. Let's summarize the points of this chapter. Buck Angel said affirming healthcare's bad, and he's a trans guy, so it's bad. These youths allegedly won't have the sex life Shrier wants them to, which is bad. These AFAB youths have bought the feminist lie that men have it better, and so are transitioning to get on the better instead of embracing the gift of womanhood. The parents should find support groups, which has never gone poorly, and double down on not supporting their child's identity. Triple or quadruple down even. Whatever it takes to make sure your child can give you grandbabies. She doesn't seem to particularly care about the harm this book is potentially doing, as she sees it as the lesser of two evils. And finally, these youths really just need to call home despite everything that led to them cutting things off. I don't think anybody was holding their breath at this point that Shrier would grow a modicum of empathy and change things in this last chapter. If that happened, this book wouldn't have been published. But ending all of this by basically painting the parents as the victims, that's a bold move I wasn't exactly expecting. Odds are, if you're watching this, you've already seen it, but just in case, Caitlin Conrad has a series that goes behind closed doors in gender-critical parent spaces. They show the ease and speed with which parents can be brought into the non-affirming fold. It's terrifying how smooth the process can be for people. This book is a small part of that puzzle or network, because this is a published book. And publishers wouldn't let something bad or harmful or not true get out there, right? Not when there's a profit to be made. Not when there's a growing market for these books. It breaks my heart a bit how many parents, in trying to learn more about what's going on with their kid, get unlucky with the internet search and get directed down one of these rabbit holes. But that's why we're here, providing some pushback for the bullshit argued in this book. The things that have been included have been mischaracterized, misrepresented, or just straight pulled from an anti-trans source. But let's save the full soapboxing for the series finale, huh? Until next time, bye.